We want the class.
Oh, so if you want to use the class camera, go here to this camera button, and then switch it from instructor, class camera.
Nice. Hi, guys. Oh, I'm giant.
There we go. I'm going to maximize that for just a second so I can see what I'm doing. And that should work. And then we'll chase up you up, and then we got her back on camera button. Yeah.
Good now. I've always looked at it.
Oh, okay, yeah. You go back to the camera facing you, tap the camera window, click instructor.
Okay. Very good.
These are quick presets. They'll switch cameras and positions. So like a left turn, shot basically right where we're standing. Student wide is basically what I just put up, but we use those as quick select. And then in the class, just hit the red in button. Volume for Nadia is right here.
Okay.
And then mic mute. And then mute.
So we're controlling our volume.
Yes.
You're in the room.
In the room.
You're hearing it.
Just the ceiling speakers, yes. That just controls the speakers. Absolutely. Good to see you again.
You. Have a good day, guys.
Yes, you too.
See you next time we Zoom.
Yeah, see you next time we Zoom. That's really sweet. The confidence our team has. You guys have known me just a little too long.
Do we have any absences today that we know of?
Not that I have heard. So what do we have? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're missing
The ladies?
all 3 of them.
Nadia, we're going to give it just a couple more minutes.
No, that's fine.
I'm gonna pull these down because I know with all that snow brightness, it causes a contrast in the camera.
What's it like there, weather-wise?
Snowing.
And
cold.
Is that normal?
Very, very cold.
It's been normal for a
You
couple
never know.
weeks.
Yeah.
So,
It's fairly normal.
balmy 25 degrees.
It's tropical these days. Oh, there is. Oh, here you go.
Distracting Josh.
I'm in class. Okay. Just let them die. Okay, people die all the time.
Yeah. I did ask, but I don't know.
So it's what you call specialized expertise, man. It's just like, I hate dealing with that stuff. Bring in the pros.
Anything I have at home slash copy.
But I had to learn that last year. So
Yeah, but you know, on your resume, you come across as a tech giant.
I was like,
Yeah.
you got an extra copy that I can, was the last one? I was like, oh, sure, and it was the last copy. It's like,
Oh, I have the assignment description there somewhere, but it's like, this way, sometimes stuff if you actually have learned something.
Okay, so let's see, we're only missing
yeah, I was a little
Alex.
confused too, because I wasn't sure if you talked about an area
Yeah, I just saw it.
focus or an actual subject for an area.
Alex usually needs just a couple of minutes to get here. I think she
Surprised
messed
when
it up, but
So I get the jam, I've never gotten any lessons in disasters. But literally all I do is I take word for word notes in class. And then I just.
Okay, while we're waiting, does anyone have questions about the assignment due next week? How's that going? It's going really well, I think. Better get on it.
I think they call it official.
This was my only class. That would be
Right.
There's complete honesty right
So I'm gonna say just a word about the midterm.
Yeah, sure. Well, in any case, reach out in the next day or two if you have any questions that need answering on the assignment. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing them soon. Yeah.
So tomorrow, dress for the weather because we're going to Idler's Rest, so we'll be outside. Part of Idler's Rest is kind of in a low that gets a lot of cold air drainage. So, you know, if it's 20 here, it's likely to be 15 or 12 there. Definitely cold.
Wow.
Wonderful.
And we'll be out the whole time. So usual meeting place, 12:30 steam plant. You're going to meet me about noon in my office to go get vehicles. Okay, and then the last thing is midterm. I've been preparing the midterm, and I think so. It's basically Tuesday, a week and a half from that, right? And then you have Thursday off. It's the Tuesday before break. And then you have Thursday before break off, and Friday before break off, right? So Right,
is that the
right, so we're
second?
really nice people. I'm trying to get applause.
So is that
I don't know.
Work better when I'm told what to
If
do.
we were standing here 2 days ago, I'd say it's 2 weeks from today.
What should we do to?
The 8th and 9th.
So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna give you some clues on the kinds of things that you need to look at. Basically, what I'm doing is tracking through all the materials just chronologically, pulling out things that I think we really stress that are very important for you to know. Not gonna nitpick, but it may be very much a traditional format. I'm still playing around with some things. One thing I would like you to think about though is get in your own mind either a hypothetical or a real live situation that you've been in or already heard about in class that is a restoration situation, okay? Because I'll ask you to answer some questions with that situation in mind, okay? So that'll get away from the hypothetical and more down to the real. But a little bit more about that next week.
Great. So that's on the 6th of March. It's coming up fast. Steve will help you review next week. Oh, and with the calendar, the latest calendar is on our course website. So if you forget, just log in and check that out. Okay, we're going to get started. This is Nadia Gardner with Columbia Land Trust. She's been working for CLT for 10 some years. I had the pleasure of working down the hall from her in Astoria for several years too, and came to really respect her opinion and her professionalism, and it's just a thrill to hear from her again today. And she's been very generous to volunteer her time. So there we go, she's sharing her screen. And yeah, Nadia, you ready?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here, everybody. It really is my pleasure to be with you today. I love what I do and what I've done, and I really think that what Micah and his fellow professor have put together is a really interesting class. I wish I had been able to take it back in the day when I was in both my undergraduate and master's programs. So I thought I might just give a little bit of background on me and my personal and professional career, and then talk a little bit about Columbia Land Trust and focus a little bit on strategic and conservation planning, and then drill down into a story that I feel like illustrates some of the lessons learned for me over the last 12 years working at Land Trusts, and hopefully will be useful for you too in whatever career you choose or have already chosen and moving forward with. So just to give a little background on me, let's see, there I am. It's another picture of me with my son Mateo, who's now 2. But this is kind of a typical picture of me. I love to be outdoors and lounging and sharing it with family and friends. I grew up, I was very lucky to grow up in the Ecotopia, which is called Portland, Oregon, which is, you know, the location of the largest natural area park in the United States, Forest Park. And also there's a lot of environmental education presented for people who live and who grew up in that city. So I was lucky that way, and also lucky in my family that my mom, who was a single mom with 3 kids, always took us hiking and camping and got us involved in youth programs that were interesting to us. And so for me, that was nature. So I was really involved in Portland Audubon and other groups. Portland's got the strongest Audubon chapter in the entire country. And then, like all of the students, all 6th grade students in the state of Oregon go to camp together for a week and learn about ecology. And so I was able to do that. And then I also went back and was a counselor there for several years during high school. And then I went and started studying at the Oregon Zoo. And as part of that, I started in middle school and started working with the birds of prey there. So part of they have mostly rehabilitated birds, or birds that have been imprinted that can't be returned to the wild. And so I was able to take care of them and help rehab them, and also train them and present them to the public. So share those magnificent creatures with everybody. I apologize, I'm a little bit congested. I'm finally getting out of this horrible cold here. And so I always knew that nature and wildlife were what I cared about and really what I wanted to do. And so at 18, I went off to college and I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And actually, I was a gender studies major, but I focused on gender science and technology and studied abroad in 5 countries, learning about what different local communities are doing to do things differently than the status quo to protect their environmental quality, but also social welfare. And when I was doing that, I realized, you know, though initially I was like really excited about going and working for an international nonprofit or government agency, I realized how much I loved where I came from and how much I had to offer because of that intimate knowledge that I've been gathering really since birth. And so for me, I realized that the biggest impact I could make would be to go home and to really dedicate my life to what I cared about most. And so I came back and did a lot of environmental education and restoration, working a lot with underrepresented youth in the Portland metro area, doing you know, tree plantings and weed control and, you know, kind of more simple restoration projects with them. And then went back to grad school at 29 and went to UC Santa Barbara, which was great place to go to college. And also to surf, which I also love. You can see my surfboards behind me here. But they have a really wonderful Master of Environmental Science and Management program. And when I was there, I encountered really land trust for the first time. I had already known about, you know, the Nature Conservancy, you know, just from their publications, but didn't know that much about them. But many of the professors at Bren, the school at UC Santa Barbara, work with the Nature Conservancy California. And so I was able to really see what they did up close. And when I returned to Oregon, I went back actually to the place I'd been living since 2001, which I had moved out of Portland and I'd moved to the Oregon coast with my partner. And that's a place that's extremely rural, and there's limited job opportunities just generally, unless you're a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. And so you have to be really creative about, you know, making your career not bartending and serving coffee to tourists. And so I was really lucky. I got out, and right then the Lower Nehalem Community Trust, which is a local land trust, I think a lot like the one that you've already met with, was hiring their first staff person. And so I was hired directly out of grad school to run that organization. So I did everything from fundraising to cut down blackberries to restoration to volunteer coordination, which was fun, but was also very hard. And it was balancing a lot of different interests. And so when a job opened up with Columbia Land Trust, which was a larger, more professional organization, it was the first opening with them in 5 years. I jumped at the chance and moved over to them and worked for them for 10 years. So I have a total of 12 years of experience with Land Trust now. And I just actually left the Columbia Land Trust for personal reasons. I have a young son, and I'm kind of shifting my work-life balance a little bit. But I'm expecting that I'll be going back and working more as a contractor in the next 3 to 6 months, doing a lot of the same kind of work and continuing my dedication to nature and wildlife. So that's a little bit about me. And I wanted to note that, you know, put a plug in for working in a rural area. Like I said, you have to be sometimes a little more creative about your career path, and sometimes a little less ambitious maybe, but more about, you know, it's not about, I think in cities, you're kind of fighting your way to the top, the most prestigious, the most money making. But living in a rural area for me has been about, you know, about livability and about creativity, but also making a really big impact. Like I was saying, like you come home, you know, if you're abroad, you don't know enough, you're not local. If you come home and you're in a city, you may know it, and there may be more opportunities. But you're also one of sometimes 1 million people or more. And in Portland, you're one of 1 million people who cares about wildlife. And so I felt like if I was in a rural area, I'd actually have a bigger impact because I was different in a rural area. And it's in some ways more challenging, but also you can make a you know, really sizable impact from just one person. And I've really seen that to be true over my career. So Working in a rural area, the types of jobs that might be available are definitely land trusts and other environmental nonprofits, and also recreation-focused nonprofits, which sometimes can balance both nature and people aspects of the work. And then, of course, agencies. Out here we have the national and state parks that provide good jobs, and the U.S. and state Fish and Wildlife Services. And then local governments. Our governments are desperate for smart people. So being in places where they don't have a lot of intellectual capital can get you places faster than if you're in a place like Portland where your barista has a PhD. So that's my plug on that. And so I can't see you guys that well. So if you have a question or you want to share anything, I'm happy to entertain it. Just kind of speak up for me, will you? I can't. I heard a little mumble, but I'm like, are you trying to talk to me? I don't know.
We'll make it
We'll do this.
very clear
We'll do
if
this.
someone has a question.
Okay. All right.
Raise your hands, folks, if you have a question.
All right. And let me know if you're falling asleep too. I can, dance or something. So here's a little bit about Columbia Land Trust. My former employer, I'm gonna have a hard time not saying we. Part of being part of an organization like this is that you become part of the organization, like in many ways. And so I'm trying to shift here between it being me and me being it and me being an independent agent. But Columbia Land Trust is 28 years old now. Started in the 90s during the the wars, really, the environmental wars of the Northwest Forest Plan, trying to find a private solution to some of our environmental problems. So stays out of a lot of the kind of environmental litigation type stuff and just tries to offer solutions and possibilities to our communities and tries to find some common ground. And so here's the mission, and really it's an organization that is focused on wildlife habitat. We do have kind of forestry work that we do where we conserve forests, and often they're working for us. We do some farmland preservation, and we have a big portion of the Washington at the base of Mount Adams where we've been supporting organic dairy producers using agricultural easements. But really all that work, even if it's forestry or agriculturally focused, for us is about nature in the end. It's that working forests and working agricultural areas are better habitat than subdivisions, and then there's the more pure that we're trying to protect and restore the actual more pure habitat that provides better habitat to wildlife in the long run. So it's a regional land trust. I said it's in Oregon and Washington. There's just there's the large ones that are international, like the Nature Conservancy, and then there's Forterra, which is in Seattle, and then Columbia Land Trust are the largest. And then there's 30 total actually in both Oregon and Washington. And then across the United States, there's 1,300 land trusts. So there's quite a lot of them in the country. They've been around since the 1800s, but the vast majority are very small. They have a couple staff, or they're all volunteer run, and they're focused around one particular thing. Sometimes it's about one trail or one township or one cemetery or battleground in the South. So we're a large one. Comparably, there's 30 staff at the organization. The main office is in Vancouver, Washington, which is right across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon, and sort of the sister city for tax evaders. And there are 3 small offices with just a couple people. There's one in Hood River, Oregon, which is the windsurfing capital of the country. And there's one in Portland, and then there's one in Astoria, Oregon, which is at the mouth of the Columbia, right across from Washington also, which is where I was working. Now, what might be some differences between Columbia Land Trust and the land trust that you've already met with would be, of course, the scale. Columbia Land Trust is, fairly old from the West Coast land trust perspective, but also just very developed, has very high capacity compared to a lot of other land trusts. When I go to the national conferences, I'm always blown away at how small some of the land trusts are and how small they've been for a very, very long time. And we've the Columbia Land Trust has conserved over 30,000 acres of land in their time. So age and scale. Also, the Land Trust really focuses on fee land ownership. So not conservation easements. In fact, we avoid conservation easements whenever possible. And that's because of the liability of managing them in the long term. A lot of land trusts focus on them because they're donated, and you can get stuff done if you have limited funding available. But from our perspective, we have a good amount of funding available and a large area with a lot of opportunity. And we choose, if we can, to own land or to buy land and to pass it to other agencies and organizations that are appropriate, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, is a very common group that we work with. So that's a big difference probably between us and them. Our focus on wildlife, and then finally conservation planning. Columbia Land Trust is very strategic. And we do the outreach usually on projects we're pursuing. So we don't wait for landowners to contact us, but we really do a lot of comprehensive conservation planning and cold call people that we know own land that are of interest to us. And that's kind of uncommon also from a smaller land trust perspective. Even if it's a donation, the land trust, if they call us, we're very likely to not pursue a project. And that's because land ownership is, well, first of all, any acquisition takes an exact amount of time. So if you're going to accept a donation that's a half acre, or you can buy something that's 100 acres, if the funding is available, you'd rather buy the 100 acres if it's a higher priority. And so we really, the acquisition side of things, we're very concerned about staff capacity and what we're giving up if we're moving forward with other projects. And then also long-term land ownership and responsibly restoring and managing restored lands, it's not free. Even once you've owned it, or if it's even donated to you, it's very expensive if you're going to do it right. And so we're careful that we are only moving forward on projects that we think are the highest priority and that can persist over time, and we have the funding to support. And we're very focused on building our stewardship endowment so that we will be responsible owners of our land in the long term. So I encourage you to take a look at the website here on this slide. And also a great way to get to know land trusts is to sign up for, to friend on Facebook and on Instagram. Columbia Land Trust has a really great staff of 2 that does all their outreach. And it's really fun to take a look at what they're doing on social media in particular. But we have a great website and videos and things like that. So take a look. Hello, there we go. Okay. So this is our region. You can see, so 30 people seems like a lot until you see the size of our region. The Columbia Land Trust serves the last 200 miles of the Columbia River. The Columbia is, the backbone of the Northwest. It starts in Canada and goes through 5 states before it ends up and is in Idaho. And this lower 200 miles is really, the last couple dams are in our region here, and then it opens up into the estuary, right about, let's see, the last dam is like somewhere in here. And then the estuary is actually technically the last section there is the estuary, because there's tidal influence actually up through Portland, believe it or not. But then the saltwater intrusion is till about, right about here. So you have the salt definition of an estuary, and then you have the tidal definition of the estuary within our region here. But our ecoregions are really different. On the east side, you have the Columbia Plateau and the East Cascades, very dry, high plateau, sage grouse kind of country, mule deer, great hunting I hear. And then the West Cascades, of course, like Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Mount Hood. So you have on one side dry climate, on the other side, and then very high topographically, and then the other side wet, and then it gets super wet as you go towards the Willamette Valley, this is the I-5 corridor here, which is a very strong agricultural floodplain region of the Willamette and the Columbia. and then out into the Coast Range, and then the estuary here. So those are our ecoregions. And I want to just note, so, you know, in 28 years, a lot happens in a land trust, or in history, really. And so we develop new strategic plans about every 5 to 8 years over our lifetime. And we just finished our latest strategic plan. And, you know, it's kind of more of the same in some ways. You know, we're focusing on nature, and agriculture and forestry is part of that, because we want to, you know, make sure that stuff is still persisting, but also it provides habitat to a lot of species. But what's new, I thought you might be interested in. One is that we're pretty purist in terms of our work, in that we don't do a lot of people stuff. We are about wildlife, and a lot of people who work for them, including myself, are, you know, like elk better than people, and don't really like trails very much because they're a lot of work. And but we realize today that we don't live and work in a vacuum, and that people are part of the landscape. And in the end, if people don't care about nature and wildlife and water quality and all that, what we do will all be for naught. And so we, as part of our work, have to figure out a way to reach people so that they care about nature, maybe not quite as much as I do, but at least enough that they'd be willing to act on behalf of it. Statistically, people don't really care that much about nature. I mean, not enough that they donate, not enough that they volunteer, and not enough that they vote focused on those issues. And so if we could get even a few more percentages in our areas that really care the way that we care about nature, then we'll make a lot more difference in the long term. And so we have a new focus on what we call fostering a culture of stewardship. So caring for our natural resources, the things that provide us so many, you know, as people, provide us so much just for us, let alone the intrinsic value and the value to wildlife. So we're exploring right now, like, what are the most effective ways to do that? Is that, you know, is that to build trails, or is that to launch a PR campaign? Is that to just spend more time with elected officials? Is that to get into or to partner with groups that do environmental education for kids in rural areas in particular? You know, what is that? And then the other thing we're working on is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most of the people in my group look just like me, very white and middle class to upper class, and educated. And most of America is not going to look like that. It isn't already looking like that. And the demographics are shifting. And so if we're not adapting, if we're not bringing into the fold people of less represented communities, people of color, people of other ethnic backgrounds, people of other language speakers, again, we'll leave behind a lot of the people, and those people won't act on behalf of nature either. So how do we, we're starting with internal work. We're trying to recognize our own problems internally. And, you know, we've been doing this for about a year and a half now, and we have a wonderful person that comes out of Seattle, has been working with us to make us to recognize the issues we already have with an organization, even being mostly the same. And so that we will be able to invite people of color and other groups into our organization as staff people and as volunteers, and to bring in interns, really focusing on those groups. And then taking that next step, how do we, again, foster that culture of stewardship in different groups, so that 20, 50 years from now, when my kid is my age, he will live in a place where everyone is equally interested and involved in conservation for wildlife. So we did a strategic planning effort, and then the next step we took actually was we developed a comprehensive conservation strategy, and that came up with different goals for each of our ecoregions, because they're different. And so I thought I'd just look at right now the coast ecoregion, because it's the one I'm the most familiar with. And so these are the overreaching goals for that coast ecoregion. It's about giving rivers room to flow and move. As you know, on the Columbia, there's lots of dams and dikes and ditches and things that have caused, enabled people to be able to farm and store water and things, but also really devastated wildlife, and especially salmon and steelhead runs, eulachon, lamprey, others that really rely on those more natural off-channel habitats. Protecting the older forests, we have northern spotted owl and marble murrelet, which are both old growth reliant, among other species. Increasing the prevalence of tidal wetlands in the lower river, conserving the coastal interdunal wetlands and lakes, and that's primarily on the beach in the Long Beach Peninsula in Washington that we're focusing on that. And finally, strengthening local economies and expanding public awareness about conservation benefits. So providing these areas that we're protecting, but also communicating to the public we're doing it and why. And also as part of that saying, well, we're doing it for trumpeter swan, but by the way, by doing this, we're also protecting your island aquifer, which is highly susceptible to pollution, which your wells are connected to. So really protecting your human health at the same time. And then as part of, we created those goals, and then we drilled down doing a GIS analysis and came up with the conservation opportunity areas. And we're currently, so here's Astoria right here. Here's where I am down here. That's where I live. And Astoria is here. It's the oldest West Coast city. Looks kind of like a mini San Francisco, a beautiful big hill. Micah used to live there. And then here's the mouth of the Columbia. So it's a very large, it's like 8 or 10 miles wide there, isn't it, Micah?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, 8 or 10 miles wide here. And then Washington's over here. And so you have the Long Beach Peninsula here. And then this is Willapa Bay, which some of the best oysters in the world come from there. So if you see Willapa Bay oysters, eat them. And so these were our kind of overreaching priority areas. And then right now, the Land Trust is in the process of drilling down in the priority 1 and priority 2 areas. And doing a parcel analysis, trying to figure out, okay, well, so in these very large conservation opportunity areas, really where should we focus? What are the sub-watersheds, and what are the actual parcels we should be looking at? And so they look at, different criteria, the size of the parcel, the location, the water resources, if there's wetlands or there's stream miles on the property, the human infrastructure, whether there's roads, neighbors, dikes, ditches, culverts, all that data is available. And then of course, endangered species and priority habitats within that too. So that gives you these cool maps that, have different scales, like, dark red, light red, orange, yellow. And you think, great, okay, I'm going to go out and this is what we're going to do. And I'm just here to tell you that you can use all the technology in the world to get you to that. And in the end, it won't matter one whit until you get out on the land. And it's really important that you do that. You take that technology and you take it for what it is. They always say, all models are wrong. Some models are helpful. And that's really what this is. It's a model. And it gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you all the way by any means. And so what I thought we could do is just look at an example of a project that I worked on, and I can talk to you just a little bit about the complexity, like once you get down to it. So this is right across from Astoria, which is kind of over here across the 10 miles of Columbia River. And then this is the Columbia River, and this is Baker's Bay. And there's the ocean. So you can see that we're really in the mixing zone. It's very salty in here. And all of the Columbia River salmon, from Idaho, from way back, are coming this way. And if they make it through those dams, 14 dams, right? They're getting out here and as juveniles. And they used to think that almost all of them just boogied out. They took off as fast as they could. But it turns out they hedge their bets, and a good number of them stay in the estuary for a couple years, or a year or two at least. And so what we're trying to do, and what Micah's previous organization did, and I think you also have heard from Scott McEwen. I know you've already spoken with Scott McEwen about it. Is provide off-channel juvenile habitat to provide to increase the chances for those fish to be able to, you know, eat, hide from predators, and grow as big as they can before they make their way out into the scary ocean. And there's tons of predators. Like these islands right here, this is East Sand Island here that is just covered in, well, historically was covered in cormorants and other salmon-eating birds. And so the more off-channel habitat that you provide, the better chance they get. And so that's just one leg in a multi-legged chair or stool in talking about salmon and steelhead survival, but it's an important one. We've taken away, I think they said 77% of Sitka spruce tidal swamp in the lower Columbia in the past 100 years. And so if we can just give them back a tiny percentage of that, we're giving them a fighting chance from a habitat perspective. So here's this great example of what GIS might find you. You have all this developed area that's totally out of the question. You can't do any work there. You have this WDFW Chinook area here, Chinook Preserve. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's actually a state park here, Crest. Another group that Micah previously led has done a culvert work here, reconnecting these wetlands. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has done some, but not enough, restoration here. Actually, Columbia Land Trust just bought recently another 200 acres here. And then you have the Cape Disappointment State Park, which is part of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Park, actually. And other conservation areas where you've got this nice connectivity and nearby projects. At the beginning, we thought this is 66 acres, which is a pretty good size. You want to get something at least 50 acres. You want to, bigger and better, but it is better. But in this area, the Long Beach Peninsula, because it's a resort area, there's a lot of subdivisions. So there's very limited opportunity for large scale restoration. So that's a pretty good size. And then you also had this river running over here, which is the Wallaket River, and then you had Baker Bay here, so you had direct Columbia River estuary access and backwater access. So that looked really good from a GIS perspective, and then you get out on the site. Get out on the site and you check it out. So here's an aerial photo of it again. So there's a road running over here. Here's that Wallaket River wrapping around in Baker Bay with tidal wetlands in the front and around the back. There's a house and a bunch of infrastructure and junk over here. There's a subdivision right here. And this road is partially on a dike. And this river it has 3 culverts underneath here, and with tide gates, which limit fish access above it. So you have this opportunity, but you have very limited fish opportunity above there. So you learn that by going out on the land, and at least looking at it from aerial photographs, and then going out on the road and kind of taking a look. And you say, okay, well, that still sounds pretty good. I wonder what the landowner is thinking. And so the next step has to be a cold call. And so that's what I did back in 2008. I identified this project and worked with my team to vet it somewhat, and then send a letter. Dear John Enyart, my name is Nadia Gardner. I'm a super nice person. I work for this great organization, and I'm wondering if you might call me and we can talk a little bit about the future of your land. And so I've sent hundreds of those letters in my career. It's amazing. People are really responsive and curious, and they'll call you back almost always, and are very nice. And so that's kind of your first step into figuring out, okay, well, now I know the land's good, but what are the landowners up to? What are they interested in? So back in 2008, we were still, it was end of 2007, we were still kind of in the heat of the market. It was starting to slow. There were things going on, but we couldn't really figure out what was going to happen. And you might remember shortly after that, everything tanked. But at that time, the landowner had been talking to several parties about subdividing this property for subdivision, like full-on condos and townhouses and all this crazy stuff. 16 lots, I think, and then he had it appraised for $2.2 million, which in this area is a lot of money. Things don't tend to go for that much, but we were at the heat of the market. They had these ideas that they could do this. They didn't have a wetland delineation though, so from the beginning, red flags were raised. They actually provided that appraisal to me, and I thought, that's just not gonna fly from a. We work from a Yellow Book appraisal standard, which is the federal standard that they have to use when they're buying properties for federal agencies, and they're very comprehensive. And you can't make assumptions. And one of the assumptions at this site was that you could build that many units, and especially with sea level rise, I think you'd be crazy to build a bunch of houses out here because they will be flooded in a certain number of years. And so, I had talked to the landowner quite a bit and walked the land with him, was learning a little bit about him. And I realized, just from a feasibility standpoint and where he was at and we were at, where funders were at, it wasn't gonna work. So we walked away. And John never sold the property. So in 2011, I went back to them. And I said, hey, John, a lot has happened between now and 2008. How are you feeling about your land? And there's a lot of coffee drinking at this kind of level. And I want to encourage you, if you're getting in the business, quote unquote, to really spend some time with the coffee drinking. Because you can learn a lot. You can have tea if you want. Actually, you often have to have. If you're a woman, you have to have black coffee and get really, serious. Some of these guys are like, good old boy. You put on your cowboy boots for it. But for me, I always described it as theater because you have to, really play a part to communicate with different people and. But it's not hard really because. I'm from Portland, Oregon. I'm a flaming liberal, and I think, sometimes out in these rural areas, and I differ from the people that I'm working with quite a lot politically, and on a lot of different issues. And but it never comes up because, and in the end, I have really great relationships with a lot of people I've worked with on these projects because when it comes down to it, I'm the same as them on one major thing, which is the love of the land. And most of the people that I've worked with have either inherited the land from multi-generational family. They really are rooted in the land, or they've moved here from somewhere else, but moved here because they love the land. They love the land, they love the water, they love the wildlife. We are the same in our love for nature. And so that's really what I focus on when I'm working with different people is just that commonality. I would say in terms of elk, which we have a lot of, you may love them to take pictures of them and to watch them or to shoot them, but you both love them. And so as long as you stick to that script, you can get pretty far. So any questions so far? Any curiosities?
Yeah, we have a couple questions. Go ahead, Mark.
My one question was back to your diversity and inclusion plans from where you guys hired that consultant in Seattle.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything from that consultant why the diversity of individuals going to work in land trust or environmental stuff, or the reasons why, like certain communities? I mean, what was his take on it?
Why currently it's as white middle class as it is, you mean, or why we should do it?
No, why you haven't got any diversity or haven't got any people involved of color to go and participate in the environmental jobs like this?
Yeah, so that's a complex question, but I can kind of take a stab at it. So part of it is we're all white, and sometimes it's hard to get, I think in any industry, where you don't see yourself reflected in the people that are there, it's sometimes more challenging to feel invited. So there's that. But there's also like, I think in nonprofits generally that is the case, except in churches possibly. And so part of the nonprofit side of things is that it's a privilege to be able to choose a career that like this one. And so my family was poor. I grew up, my mom was the school teacher and there was 3 of us, and we didn't have much support, but she credited everything to get us opportunities like the kinds of opportunities I had as a kid and going to college. And so I think it's easier if you are from privilege to be able to go to college, and also to be able to choose a career that might not pay as well. And so, I mean, though there's people like myself that come from more challenged backgrounds, I think it's more common that that it's easier being middle or upper class to, number one, get a college education, number 2, choose that. But and then there's also, like, if you look at programs like even at my school, the UC Santa Barbara, California is not majority white anymore, but my program was. And so when I was there, we were challenging our administration, like, are you actively going to communities of color? Because there's a lot of segregation. Are you actively going to communities of color and going to career and college fairs in schools that have a larger populations of color that might be interested? Because statistically, actually, if you look at what people care about, there's actually not that much difference. In fact, I think that some of the research has shown like the Latino population cares more deeply than the white population about nature and is more connected to it historically. And so so it's not that that we have differences in terms of like what we care about. It's just the pathways to get to these different things. And so what we're trying to figure out is like, how do we make the pathway easier to get to us, and how do we invite people in? How do we be part of the solution to that? And so, I think that the easy solution is to invite, interns into your organization that are from these particular programs that target trying to get underrepresented communities into environmental or nonprofit work. That's kind of the easy way that they're doing it. But if you haven't done the internal work that you can recognize the things that you're doing in the organization that could alienate those people once they get there, then you could be in worse position than before. So does that help?
Well, sort of. I was thinking some of it could be the phobia of those particular diverse communities going into rural communities of these landowners, like you said, good old boys, and that's the stereotypical thing that you got to get over the hump, because if you can find a common connection, then you can get the job done. I mean, because I personally have had to encounter that, and I'm going into a field that is predominantly white, but I've been working with a lot of tribes, but at the same time, I'm finding myself up against the wall with tribes too. So it's just over time, I guess it will evolve, because I think in the long run, we are going to have to get more environmentally conscious, because there's really no more land. If you really look at it, unless you want to go north and see what Canada has, but it's too cold. People in diversity colors, it's too cold.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we're in Oregon, just like you guys, Oregon and Washington, primarily white, but about, I think actually in our rural areas, where I live is about 20% Latino. And then we have a little bit of other ethnicities around, but like you said, tribes are a big player in rural areas. My land trust works in the urban area too. And so I think it's easier for them to think about, that, but you make a really good point about, honestly, it comes down to prejudices and safety. In rural areas, but I'll say even as a woman, it's definitely not for the faint of heart, because all the people that I work with are men, and they're all quite a bit older than I am. I'm 43 now, but I started at in this work 29, and so it's you have to negotiate all that identity stuff as part of the work, and it's sometimes, you know, pretty challenging. So I was a women's studies major, and I can say like understanding that stuff coming into it gives me a little bit more nuanced you know, I can play with it a little bit more in my mind and have thought it out before I actually encounter it. But on the tribal side of things, I will say, I'll acknowledge that that's a big challenge for the land trust too. Especially on the east side, we have some large tribes with large reservations and that are strong, and they're politically very, they've got a lot of clout, but there's also a lot of resentment around that stuff. And so negotiating, especially county leadership and the tribes on the east side has been, you know, how do we make sure that we're supporting different groups but not getting in the middle of it? Now that's an ongoing issue for, I think, all of us. And then also just the intertribal conflict. We have casinos, and so anytime somebody wants a new casino, the other tribes are out to get them. And so, you know, how do you like, you know, honor tribal history and culture and work with these different groups, which often will have funding sources available to you, and you can collaborate without damaging a relationship with another tribe that might have conflict with that tribe. That's going to, I think, forever be a challenge for us and for other organizations, but it's important work. I will say, so my job, you know, the land acquisition side of things, it's not for everyone, no matter what. You know, we had several other people in my group try to move into acquisitions, and they couldn't handle the human part of it, in the cold calling and that initial. So it's kind of for extroverts, I think, for sure. But if you find that it's the right one for you, it's a really interesting niche to be in. I really enjoyed it. So let's try to get back to things here. Where am I at here? I'm going to 1:30 max, right, Micah?
We actually have till 1:45, so we don't have to cut you off real strict there at 1:30. We'll just make sure to allow some time for questions.
Okay. So I want to point out, you know, we care about salmon, but we care about a lot of other stuff too. And this is actually you know, this river has tons of river otter, and it's really fun to watch them from the bridge right here. And then of course there's elk. And then this is actually a picture of a bear just right up the road that one of our volunteers took. So there's a lot of other charismatic megafauna on the property too. Here's some not that inspiring photos of property. I couldn't find great ones, but this is the front. This is the tidal wetlands on Baker Bay. And then this is the mouth of the Wolcott River as it opens up into Baker Bay. So so let's see what else. So I learned a lot from this landowner. I came back in 2011. I developed this relationship with this landowner, and I figured out his history and kind of what motivates him. I met his brothers, and I learned, you know, how he got this land. He also owns 1,000 acres on Savi's Island, which is like multi-million-dollar property right next to Portland. And I was like, how did this guy get this? And it turned out he had married in the 1940s, there was a card shark in Portland. He was this kind of basically a mafia guy, and he owned all the card rooms in Portland. And there's actually a book called Portland Confidential, all about the like Portland underground of the 40s. And this guy would go over to Honolulu, and he frequented a brothel. And at that brothel, there was a madam, and her name was Babe. She was an Asian woman, and he ended up marrying her and bringing her back to the States. And she was like 10 or 20 years to his junior. So he died, and she ended up marrying her hairdresser, who was 10 or 20 years to her junior. And that is John, the landowner of this land. So it's always interesting to me, like, how do these guys, you know, he's a really soft-spoken guy, and actually he's a Cherokee Indian. And so you get these really like rich stories from people about them and their lives and kind of what makes them tick. And So another thing they learned when we were doing our reconnaissance is like, wait a second, this doesn't really seem like it's 60 acres. You know, let's do some GIS work here. And it turned out, looking at the legal description and doing some analysis, that the property is more like 113 acres, so more than twice as big, or about twice as big. And then, so we used that calculation. We did an appraisal, and our appraisal came back at $572,000. And so that is a lot less than what he wanted. And that's when the relationship part comes into play. Is like, you know, here you go, John, here's the appraised value, and this is what we're able to pay because our state and federal funding sources will tell us that you can only pay appraised value for your properties. We won't pay you a cent more. You can negotiate other aspects of the deal, but that is a deal breaker if you go above that. And so, so having that relationship with John and with his brothers, and having those years of conversations, and having forged that connection about the land and the wildlife there, made us succeed, believe it or not. And also, you know, the downturn in the economy didn't hurt. So he was willing to sell for that appraised value. In the meantime, he let his brother move into the house, and even though it rained through the roof. And unfortunately, that triggers relocation, which is when the federal government takes property, whether it's bought or through, it's about eminent domain really, but if you buy land too, it triggers something called relocation. You actually have to help them move and pay for everything. So that makes things more complicated. And then there's a lot of junk there, so we did an environmental site assessment, which is otherwise known as a phase 1, and turned out there was a bunch of junk, and there were some storage tanks, and you know, that's kind of normal for a farm. But we saw a couple barrels that were under some blackberries. And, you know, went back to the brother and was like, hey, do you know, what's the story with those barrels? Because I couldn't see if there were more because of the blackberries. And he's like, oh, yeah, well, a couple years ago, John, you know, he paid somebody to come in and take out some stuff, but then he didn't pay him. And so they came in the middle of the night and dumped 50 barrels full of chemicals on the property. And so I wouldn't have known that if I didn't spend the time with my brother. So we had to go in and excavate. There were 50 barrels, and a lot of them had spilled. And the soil was sand. And so it moved really quickly down through the soil. And we had to take that out, and it cost us, I think, you know, $20,000 or $25,000 to do that work. But we finally succeeded, and in 2012 we closed, and we relocated the brother out of the reigning house. So it took us 4 years from start to finish to actually acquire the property, and that was with the funding being Bonneville Power Administration money being readily available. So if we had been in a position where we had to go write grants and stuff, it would have been definitely more challenging than that. So now we own it, and this is the actual ownership. And turned out it was 117 acres, not 113, when we actually did a survey. And so you can see here's the houses and all the junk laying everywhere. And then this is the LiDAR, the topographic survey of the site. And so you can see there's a road that's on a dike over here. And there's ditches, and there's a dike along here. And there's ditches here. And then historically, there were tide gates on culverts, like all along here. And there's also a road that ran along the front of the property here. And so I'm not a stewardship or restoration specialist, but my team worked with a consulting firm, Interfluve, out of Hood River. And they did a bunch of modeling and design work to do the restoration. And it's, you know, just like most of the work we do, it's ditch filling, dike removal, culvert and tide gate removal, large wood placement, weed control, and native planting.
Hey, Nadia, I have a question. What responsibility, if any, does Columbia Land Trust have towards maintaining the road/dike that separates the property from the neighboring subdivision?
Yeah, good question. Well, so this is in the city of Ilwaco limits, and that's the city of Ilwaco road. And technically, like if a private landowner, any private landowner, you know, intentionally or unintentionally damaged property like that, or any private property, there's an opportunity for them to sue for damages. But of course, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to go through that. And so our policy is to you know, after learning some lessons, Micah, as you know well, in the Grays River over time, is to really work to solve any issues ahead of time and to proactively do more than what we're required to do to design our projects to protect human infrastructure. And then also, if there are unintended consequences, to pony up the money to fix them, whether we are legally obligated to or not. And, and we've just learned that it's better to be really good neighbors because we're targets as a conservation organization, and as something that's like kind of seen as, you know, big organization from the big city money bags, even though we really don't. It's all grant funded, grant and contact funded. But it's just what we figured out we have to do. So this gets back to the human thing, and that's what I just kind of wanted to get to you. You know, the message I wanted to give to you guys today is that, you know, no matter what you're doing, so maybe you're on the restoration side of things, it's really important to communicate with the landowner, but also the neighbors, because they know a lot more than anybody else. And they may be annoying sometimes. You're like, oh, I'm in a rush and I don't have time for this. And you're just, you know, you're just being NIMBY or something. But there's always information that you get by communicating respectfully with community members that you wouldn't have otherwise. And they can save you a lot of headaches down the line. And so in this case, there's a lot of people. So there's a subdivision here that should never have been built. It's built in a bunch of wetlands. So it's already prone to flooding. And that's why there's these culverts with tie gates here, but also that this is on a dike. So if you're going to remove this dike, there's water coming in and out of here. We thought this was fine, like they did modeling and it seemed fine, but it turned out there was a ditch here and actually a culvert that we didn't know about, that wasn't mapped anywhere, that wasn't in the GIS, and was covered in willows and blackberries. And the neighbors knew it was there. And so they came and told us. And so we were able to change the design to seal that up, or to you know, provide better drainage elsewhere, and then also build a berm along here that better protects that road than what currently, even before the dike is removed, it provides. Because at high water events, they were actually having water pouring over it even without the dike removed. So that was really important information we wouldn't have known if we hadn't talked to them. The modeling is really important because we thought, okay, great, we pull out this dike here and it's no problem over here, right? I mean, it's slow moving water, but it turned out that the model showed that there'd be erosion along here. And so, you know, we had to really be careful about where the dike was leveled and where it wasn't. And then also communicate with those neighbors across the road so that if there are any issues down the line, that they'll communicate with us. And that's another thing, is that you develop those relationships now so that in 5 years when there's some massive problem, they call you and they're nice to you. They say, hey, Nadia, you know, there's this crazy thing happening, you know, can you help? And instead of calling you and saying, how dare you, you know, start off with that positive relationship and get that information and have that those eyes and ears in the long term. So we did all that work, all that restoration work just last year. So that was 5 years after we closed. And so in total, the whole project was 9 years long. It was almost my entire career at Columbia Land Trust. And weed control is going to be ongoing. There's a gorse there, which is just a nasty, it's like Scotch broom with spikes and other stuff. And then you'll always be neighbors to communicate with there. And then there's hunting that happens there. We do hunting by permission on most of our properties. So there's some people who like to hunt for elk on our property there. There's community members who are interested in walking access there. So how do you balance hunting versus walking dogs on this road on the front? And there's Also interested in developing a trail on this old road, because this is actually an old Native American village site, and they actually think that maybe Lewis and Clark camped there back in the day as well, in 1805 or so. So there's people who are interested in cultural history that would like to explore these more human aspects of the land with us in the long term. So, like I said, land ownership is not free, and it's forever. So that's why you have to really be careful to make sure you're ready when you're entering into a project, whether you're a land trust or a restoration entity. You know, I worry sometimes that restoration happens, especially on public lands, and then the group walks away, and then the agency has some responsibility, but may not have really the capacity to follow up when they need to, and so the long-term care is not as great as it can be. So I encourage you to try to leverage your capacity by, you know, working with community members, but also really just be cognizant of that. How do we design projects that are as stable as possible, and how do we make sure that they're taken care of as they need to be in the long term? So that's pretty much what I was thinking about talking to you about today. Just that people are always part of the equation, and that you take the time to communicate with them, and you'll learn a lot more than you think you wanted to know, and it'll really get you where you want to go if you're lucky. So,
Great.
any other
Nadia,
questions? Yeah.
Yeah, Nadia, you rattled off quickly there, I think, your 8 most common practices in restoration. I wanted to make sure I got those right.
These are our activities. Yeah. So in the title restoration, the things that we're doing are dike removal, ditch filling, culvert and tie gate removal or replacement, large wood installation, weed control, and native planting. And also, we'll often do tidal channel recreation too, or we'll just kind of get it started, and so that'll allow water to create its own channels in the long term. But kind of because it's been so altered so long, it's important sometimes to like just cut it in so that it can get going, and not just jump right back into where historically there were ditches. Because there's land has a lot of memory in a lot of ways. And that's what's cool about this LiDAR, is that often it'll show you the memory of human infrastructure, but it'll also often show you the memory of the old tidal channels that you can't see even from an aerial photograph. This one doesn't show it as well, but some of our projects really, like Carey Island and others, you can see these really beautiful winding tidal channels that persist even though there's a whole series of ditching. And it just wants to get reconnected. It just wants to serve wildlife.
Other questions? Nadia, I have a question about what triggers the decision to move ownership from the land trust to a agency like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Because it seems to me that you all have better resources in terms of stewarding the land frequently. And also, there's the question of removing that land from the tax base, because I know you all continue to contribute to the local communities in that respect. So when is it right to move a parcel into U.S. Fish and Wildlife or WDF&W or some other agency? When does it make sense to do that?
Well, so because we're private, often we can buy land that more quickly and more nimbly, and also we get through those political boundaries easier in rural areas where there's a real distrust of the government. And we do pay taxes. We choose, so as a nonprofit, any nonprofit doesn't have to pay property taxes.
Right.
And so as that, we choose to pay property taxes in a couple counties, but for the most part, we don't. We do go to exemption in counties that have a more robust and diverse tax base. In Wahkiakum County and a couple others, Klickitat County, because politically that was a big issue for the county commissioners, and also they're very poor. So Wahkiakum County, large county with only 5,000 people. So, and then most of the land is in industrial timber, and they have very limited property tax burden on them. And so for them, like if we had worked there without paying taxes, they would have kicked us out as fast as they could. So we made that choice, at least for now. The state and federal agencies actually often do pay taxes in lieu. They're not required to in some cases, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually does. They pay significant amounts of taxes in lieu. So there's this perception that they don't pay taxes, though. So there's the perception and there's the reality. And so just to clear that up.
Sure.
And for me, I think it's really important for the land trust to get control over the land and to restore it and to get it to a stable condition, semi-stable, 3 to 5 years after a restoration project. But I don't feel strongly that the land trust is necessarily the long-term, has to have to own it in the long term. And if there is an adjacent public property or there's a recreation aspect and there's an agency that's better equipped to manage that, then I think a state or federal agency is a better owner. Also, we keep getting more and more land and we're not growing that fast. So with such a large region and limited resources and staff capacity, it's important that you partner with whoever is there that's doing at least good work. Maybe not the best work, maybe not as good as we do, but at least if you give them something that's stable, then you have a pretty good opportunity for it to persist and be positive over time. That's my view. So in some cases we'll directly, we actually be doing a deal for a state or federal agency, but I think more and more as we become larger, this is certainly the case with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is divesting from most of their land in the United States, and they're passing it to other groups like ourselves, but also to agencies. And it's just about okay, if you're going to keep going, you can't manage. It's better to not manage at all. It's better to try to find a strong local partner that can be there more often and has adjacent land and is it kind of a natural. But in some cases, I think we will hold it, I don't know forever, but they say in perpetuity. But I encourage land trusts to explore it when it makes sense. So for example, Micah, the Locomin River properties that are directly adjacent to the Julia Butler Hansen for Columbia white-tailed deer.
Right.
Once those are all restored and they're directly adjacent, I don't see any reason why we need to retain them except for that political reason that in that county, the public agency ownership is controversial. So we can cross that bridge when we get there, when we finally restore all that land.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Nadia, can you just clarify a little bit more why you started out saying conservation easements are something you try to avoid? Is it specifically the cost, or is it the management of the situation, or both?
Well, so conservation easements are a tool in the toolbox. There's deed restrictions, conservation easements, conservation agreements, and then fee ownership. And if you want maximum control over a property, especially if you want to restore it, or if you want to have human, like recreational access or something, it's my view that fee ownership is your best bet. If you're buying an easement, if you're buying as much as you want to buy in an easement, because easements can be like, you can't cut a tree, or they can be, you can't do almost anything. If you want to get, maximum protection through an easement and you're buying it, it may be the same price as the fee actually. So there's that. Like I said, I think most groups that are doing a lot of easements, it has to do with because it's a donation. And so you just kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of that and figure out, are you protecting exactly what you want to protect using that tool? And can you raise the money that's necessary to do what you have to do by law So that's annual monitoring and defend the easement. So one legal case for a conservation easement can cost you, $30,000-$50,000, and maybe even more depending on what you're defending. And so the IRS requires that you do that if they take if the landowner takes a tax deduction, and they are policing land trusts right now on that. So sometimes free is not free. So if it's up to us, we'd rather pay the money up front and know we don't have that fear of the lawsuit or of a legal issue down the line. And it's funny, there's not just managing it. So we do have some easements, especially in the urban areas. Some of them we inherited when we merged with another land trust. And even the landowners that donated the easement that wanted to protect the things that were in the easement violate them. Like they do stupid things like build gazebos, and so you actually have to enforce on them. And sometimes it's not going to court, but it's taking a lot of time. Our staff take a lot of time going out there and documenting and communicating with the landowner and trying to work out, okay, what needs to be done now? You built a gazebo in the area that you said was supposed to be a swamp. Do you take it out, or do you amend the easement, or do you add in a different property, or so that kind of stuff takes a lot of time, and time is money as well as capacity. So those are some of the pitfalls of easements. They can be a good tool, but they're a complex tool, and you have to really go into it with your eyes very wide open.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. You said something about amending the easements. Can you kind of expand on what that process looks like, or how often that happens?
Well, it's a it's a big topic right now in the land trust world, and if you're interested in learning more about land trusts and the complexity around that stuff, I urge you to go look up the Land Trust Alliance website. They have tons of materials on there, and they actually have a learning center. If you work with a land trust, you can get access to that. I think there's because you have to be a member, I think, to get into some of that stuff. But there's a lot of research going into that right now, because a lot of our easements as a land trust community are older now, and we're looking back and going, why did we do that? And so it's not easy, especially if there's been a tax deduction. I'll put it that way. And so you have to go through a legal process to make sure that you are not losing anything. In fact, they prefer that you're adding something. If you're making those kinds of amendments. They purposely made it these kinds of conservation easements are forever. They're in perpetuity, and that's good, but it's also complicated because, of course, the world is not a static place. Like, we didn't know about global warming, 40 years ago. And so what is it, so say there's an easement on this property, which is it's in a tsunami zone. It's right at ground zero in terms of sea level rise and increased storm events. So if we said you have to keep it forested, for example, and it flooded and killed all the trees, then, what happens then? So the world changes in ways that you don't know about. And so in 40 years, we're going to look back at the easements written today and go, why did we do that? So the amendment process, it's difficult and it's complicated, and so it's not preferred, because the reason people don't use deed restrictions is because they're easy to remove, which means it's not permanently protected. But it's too bad there's not something kind of in between where you have, and then it's really, I guess it's really hard to change, but you also don't want someone to be able to come in and say, I want to amend this and build a golf course. So those are the pros and cons. So I guess the shorter answer is talk to an attorney.
It's always the last one.
All right, let's give Nadia a hand. Nadia, that was incredibly useful. That was the first look we got into the nuts and bolts of acquisition. And that was a great case study. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
No problem. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email them to me. I'm happy to Happy to assist, and I wish you guys the best in your studies, and hope to see you out there knee deep in mud and swamplands.
That's right.
Thanks, Nadia.
All right, thank you, Nadia. We'll see you again sometime. Take
Right.
care.